I never expected a single sentence to turn my entire night upside down, but when she looked at me with trembling eyes and whispered, "Stay close tonight," something inside my chest froze for a second before beating harder than ever. So before I take you into this emotional and psychological journey, make sure you stay till the end of this narration because every word comes from a raw place of truth. And don't forget to show your support if you want more heart-touching original stories like this. It all started on a cold, windy evening when Emily showed up at my apartment door wrapped in a long beige coat, her hair slightly messy, her cheeks red from the chilly air, and her expression carrying a storm of emotions she had tried so hard to hide from the world. Emily was my closest friend, the kind of person who always held herself together even when life tried to tear her apart, but that night she looked fragile, lost, and deeply shaken. I asked her what happened, but she simply stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and let out a slow breath as if trying to release a weight she had been holding for months. For the first time since I had known her, she didn't try to smile or pretend she was fine. Instead, she looked at me with eyes filled with a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and a silent plea for comfort. She sat on the couch, wrapped her arms around herself, and stared at the floor while I made her a warm drink, unsure how to help but wanting more than anything to make her feel safe. When I handed her the mug, her fingers brushed against mine gently, almost subconsciously, and she whispered my name with such vulnerability that my heart cracked a little. She told me she had received a call from someone she had been trying to avoid for years, someone whose presence in her life had only caused pain and confusion. She didn't go into details, but her voice shook, and her eyes filled with tears. She kept blinking away as if refusing to let them fall. She was always like that, strong, even when broken. When she finally looked up at me, something shifted between us, something unspoken yet powerful, something that felt like trust, fear, and longing all at once. She stood up slowly, walked closer, and placed her hand gently on my arm as if grounding herself. That's when she whispered the words that left me frozen, "Stay close tonight. Please." It wasn't flirtation, it was fear mixed with desperate hope for safety, for comfort, for someone who wouldn't walk away. I took a slow breath and replied softly, "Only if you don't let go," because deep inside, I didn't want to leave her alone, and maybe I didn't want to be alone either. She looked at me with surprise, almost as if she had expected me to refuse or laugh it off, but instead, she stepped even closer, resting her forehead lightly against my shoulder. I felt her shaking, not from the cold but from everything she had been carrying inside her. I wrapped my arms around her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to collapse into someone else's presence. We didn't talk much after that. We just sat together in the quiet room, the sound of the wind outside filling the spaces where words weren't enough. She finally exhaled the breath she had been holding for years, and I felt her calm slowly return, as if my presence was helping her rebuild the pieces of herself. And that night was only the beginning of a story that neither of us expected to unfold. Emily stayed curled against me as the minutes passed slowly, and with every second, I could feel the tension in her shoulders slowly melting, like someone finally finding warmth after standing in the cold for too long. I didn't want to ask questions too soon, knowing she needed space before she could let the truth spill out, so I simply held her, offering silence instead of pressure. Outside the window, the streetlights flickered weakly against the wind, casting shadows across the room that danced like the memories she had been trying to escape. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, telling me about the call she received earlier that day. The person who called wasn't just someone from her past, it was someone who had hurt her deeply, someone who had used her vulnerability against her, someone who made her believe she wasn't enough. She had spent years convincing herself she had moved on, built a new version of herself, a stronger version, but hearing his voice again had pulled her back into those old fears as if no time had passed. She confessed she didn't come to me just because she needed company, she came because I was the only person she felt safe with, the only one who had never judged her, the only one who had seen her at her lowest and stayed anyway. Her honesty hit me harder than I expected, stirring emotions I had kept buried under the surface for far too long. I had always cared for her, more deeply than friendship allowed, but I had never wanted to cross any lines or risk losing her. Tonight, however, the closeness felt different. It wasn't forced. It wasn't planned. It was natural, almost inevitable. She lifted her head and looked at me, her eyes still glassy but calmer now. She touched my hand lightly and whispered that she didn't want to spend the night alone because being alone meant her mind would spiral, replaying old memories, old wounds. I told her she didn't have to be alone, not tonight, not ever if she didn't want to. She let out a shaky breath and leaned into me again, and I felt something inside both of us shifting, healing, awakening all at once. She talked about how she had spent years pretending to be strong, convincing everyone around her that she was fine, yet tonight she couldn't hide it anymore. She said it felt strange to be vulnerable in front of someone, but at the same time, it felt right with me. I reassured her that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was trust, and trust was more powerful than pretending. She rested her head on my chest, listening to my heartbeat, grounding herself in the rhythm as if it brought her comfort. I found myself gently brushing my fingers through her hair, and she closed her eyes as if the small gesture soothed her soul. Minutes turned into hours, but neither of us noticed the time passing. It was as if the world outside disappeared, leaving only the warmth between us and the soft glow of the lamp beside us. She eventually whispered that she didn't know what she would have done if I hadn't been home, and her voice cracked slightly. I told her I was exactly where I needed to be. She squeezed my hand, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between us, something soft and fragile yet strong enough to reshape the night. Emily wasn't just seeking comfort, she was allowing herself to be held, to trust again, to feel safe. And I wasn't just offering support, I was letting my guard down too, letting her into the parts of my heart I had kept quiet. Everything about that night felt like the beginning of something neither of us had dared to imagine before. As the night deepened, Emily shifted slightly, settling more comfortably against me, and I felt her breathing slow into a calm, steady rhythm that told me she was finally letting go of the anxiety she had carried. She began sharing memories she had never told anyone before, not even her closest friends. She talked about the times she had been made to feel small, the moments when her voice had been dismissed, the relationships that left her doubting her own worth. With every confession, I felt a mixture of anger and heartbreak, not at her, but at the people who had broken something so gentle inside her. Yet she spoke not with bitterness but with quiet reflection, as if releasing the weight of her past piece by piece. I listened to her, not interrupting, just being the presence she needed. She admitted she had always feared letting someone get too close because closeness meant giving someone the power to hurt her again. That was why the words she spoke earlier, "Stay close tonight," carried so much meaning. They weren't just a request, they were trust. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine, and asked if I thought she was weak for ending up here tonight instead of handling it on her own. I shook my head and told her the truth, real strength isn't suffering alone, it's knowing when to reach out. She took a deep breath and whispered that for the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid of being seen, really seen. There was something deeply human and deeply healing about that moment. I could feel her walls slowly falling, and with them, my own walls cracked open. I told her things I had never said out loud, how I had always admired her resilience, how I had always noticed the pain behind her smile, how I had always wanted to be someone she could lean on. She listened quietly, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on the back of my hand, a small gesture that sent warmth spreading through my chest. She asked why I had never told her how I felt before, and I explained that I didn't want to risk losing her, didn't want to pressure her, didn't want her to feel obligated or uncomfortable. She smiled softly, the first real smile of the night, and said she wished I had known earlier that she always felt safe with me. The way she said it, gentle yet full of emotion, made something inside me shift. It felt like the beginning of understanding each other in a deeper, more vulnerable way. She rested her head on my shoulder again, and I felt her hand slide into mine naturally, as if it belonged there. We sat in silence for a long time, not because we had nothing more to say but because silence itself felt comforting. Pure. Honest. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost hesitant, as she admitted she wasn't sure what she felt, only that she didn't want me to leave and that something about being close to me made her feel calm in a way she hadn't felt in years. I told her she didn't need to define anything tonight. Healing wasn't a rush, it was a process. She looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something warm, gentle, and quietly growing. And maybe that was enough. Maybe closeness didn't need explanations. Maybe it just needed two hearts willing to stay. The night slowly